Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal ChatGPT.noi. As the long-awaited custody trial between Michael and Willow approached, the entire atmosphere of Port Charles was thick with unease, tension, and speculation. Every whispered conversation at the hospital, every hushed exchange at the Metro Court, every sidelong glance across the Courtroom mansion carried with it the weight of anticipation. Both Michael and Willow knew that the outcome of this trial would not only decide who would raise Wiley and Amelia, but would also define their reputations, their stability, and their very place within the intricate web of family and community ties that bound them. For Michael, it was a battle he had convinced himself he could win by sheer force of will and the crushing power of evidence. For Willow, it was a test of endurance, resolve, and trust in the alliances she thought she could count on. Yet, as the court date loomed ever closer, an undercurrent of dread ran beneath every plan and every strategy, a silent warning that nothing would unfold as expected. Michael walked into the courthouse convinced he had in his possession the weapon that would end Willow's chances once and for all. The evidence he carried, pointing directly to Willow's impulsive and dangerous decision to abduct Daisy, was damning on every level. It was the sort of revelation that could erode any credibility she might claim to have as a stable and responsible guardian. In his mind, once the court was confronted with such proof, Willow's image as a devoted mother would collapse, leaving her defenseless and vulnerable. But Michael himself was walking on precarious ground. For all his confidence, the shadows of his own recent actions loomed heavily over him. His outburst against Drew at the Metro Court, witnessed by dozens of people, was not an incident that could be easily brushed aside. It painted him as volatile, quick-tempered, and dangerously unpredictable, qualities that any judge would consider deeply concerning in the context of child custody. Michael's fury, unchecked and raw, had become a weapon turned against him, and he seemed unaware that it had weakened his case more than any counterargument Willow could present. Willow, for her part, entered the trial carrying burdens of her own, some visible and some carefully concealed. The whispers about Daisy's abduction already dogged her, threatening to dismantle every word of testimony she could offer about her maternal devotion. The slap she had delivered to Lucas, an impulsive act that showcased her inability to manage stress and confrontation, further damaged her standing. Even more precariously, the looming threat of losing her position at General Hospital hung above her like a storm cloud. Without her job, she would lose not only her income but also the perception of stability and responsibility that the court valued so highly in such proceedings. And yet, despite the mounting evidence against her, Willow placed her faith in Drew. She believed his influence, his presence, and his willingness to strike at Michael's vulnerabilities could help her turn the tide. What she did not realize was that Drew's involvement carried risks of its own, for his personal vendetta against Michael was both transparent and destructive. The more Drew pushed, the clearer it became that his motives were not about the children's welfare but about exacting revenge, something no court would overlook. As the trial began, the courtroom became a stage for every simmering resentment and every secret grievance to surface. Lawyers presented evidence, witnesses testified, and the gallery buzzed with speculation. Michael's camp insisted on showcasing Willow's reckless behavior, presenting the kidnapping of Daisy as proof she was unstable. Willow's side highlighted Michael's violent tendencies, framing his attack on Drew as a window into his volatile character. Each revelation chipped away at both parents' credibility, and the lines between truth and manipulation grew blurred. Even Dante's request to introduce traffic camera footage, placing Willow near the Courtroom estate the day Daisy was followed, threatened to crush whatever defense she had left. Still, Willow remained determined, clinging to the belief that Drew's intervention would rescue her from defeat. Yet the court was not blind to the bigger picture. Both Michael and Willow, in their desperation to win, had exposed aspects of themselves that undermined their roles as parents. Instead of demonstrating stability, patience, and the ability to put their children first, they had laid bare their grudges, their anger, and their willingness to destroy each other at any cost. What should have been a trial about Wiley and Amelia's best interests became a battlefield where pride and vengeance overshadowed love and responsibility. The presiding judge observed every moment of this unraveling with an increasingly hardened expression, weighing not only the evidence but also the destructive dynamic playing out in real time. When the verdict was finally delivered, the words seemed to hang in the air with an unbearable heaviness. Neither Michael nor Willow would be granted custody of Wiley and Amelia. The court had decided that both parents, through their actions and their instability, had forfeited the right to raise the children. Instead, custody would be awarded to Carly, a choice that stunned the courtroom into silence. The shock rippled outward, hitting Michael and Willow like twin blows. Each had prepared for victory or defeat against the other, but neither had considered the possibility that both would lose everything. The decision redefined the entire conflict, removing their control and placing the future of the children into the hands of someone they both trusted and feared in equal measure. In the stunned aftermath, whispers immediately began to spread that this verdict could not simply be the result of the judge's neutral assessment. For it to end in such a way suggested manipulation, interference, and the possibility that unseen forces had steered the outcome. Michael, furious and incredulous, could not fathom how his evidence had been neutralized. Willow, equally devastated, began to wonder if Drew's involvement had backfired in ways she could not see. Questions swirled around who might benefit most from such a ruling. Carly appeared to be the immediate victor, but was she merely the surface of something deeper, a convenient recipient chosen by those pulling strings in the background? What remained beyond doubt was that the battlefield had shifted. Michael and Willow, stripped of custody, now stood outside the circle of influence, forced to watch as Carly took on the responsibility they both craved. For them, this was not the end of the conflict but the beginning of a new and more dangerous chapter. With pride wounded, tempers raw, and suspicions festering, both were bound to seek answers, vengeance, and a way back into their children's lives. And as they did, the children at the heart of the storm, Wiley and Amelia, would remain in the center of a power struggle that showed no sign of ending. Willow's situation, already precarious, seemed to worsen with every passing day as the trial drew closer. The accusation of her involvement in Daisy's abduction alone was enough to severely undermine her credibility, but the shadows hanging over her extended far beyond that single charge. The altercation with Lucas at General Hospital had become a focal point of gossip and scrutiny, a tangible example of her inability to manage stress without resorting to physical aggression. That one impulsive slap was more than a fleeting moment of anger, it was a symbol of instability, a reminder that under pressure Willow could act recklessly, a trait no court would look kindly upon when determining parental fitness. And should she lose her job over this incident, the damage to her standing would be catastrophic. The court valued stability in a parent's life above almost everything else, steady income, reliable employment, and a consistent reputation. Without these, Willow would be painted as a woman spiraling into chaos, unfit to provide for her children both materially and emotionally. The looming threat of surveillance footage only deepened her crisis. Rumors swirled that traffic cameras had captured her car near the Courtroom estate at precisely the time Daisy was followed. That evidence, cold and irrefutable, would pierce through any argument she might muster in her defense. It wasn't merely circumstantial. It was a visual record that could transform whispers into undeniable fact. If presented in court, the footage would strip away her ability to claim coincidence or misunderstanding, leaving her exposed as the prime instigator of a reckless act. For Willow, the weight of these converging threats pressed down heavily, yet she clung to a fragile strand of hope, Drew. She convinced herself that Drew's influence, his determination, and his willingness to take the offensive against Michael would balance the scales. She stepped into the courtroom with nerves frayed and confidence waning, but her faith in Drew remained unshaken, as though his presence alone might turn an impossible battle into a survivable one. Drew, however, carried his own motives, and they were far from pure. His vendetta against Michael consumed every move he made, twisting what might have been support for Willow into something darker and more self-serving. Rather than focusing solely on defending her position as a mother, Drew sought every opportunity to corner Michael, to chip away at his credibility, and to humiliate him in front of the court. He leaned into the animosity between them, framing Michael's anger and volatility as proof that he was unfit to raise children. But in doing so, Drew blurred the line between ally and opportunist. His aggression wasn't rooted in protecting Willow or safeguarding Wiley and Amelia's welfare, it was driven by a hunger for revenge. His tactics, while momentarily effective in rattling Michael, cast a troubling shadow over the entire trial, making it increasingly evident that the case was no longer about the children but about the grudges of the adults surrounding them. The atmosphere in the courtroom quickly reflected this shift. What began as a custody hearing grew into a stage for personal grievances, hidden resentments, and old wounds to be dragged into the light. Michael bristled under Drew's provocations, his temper flaring at inopportune moments, reinforcing the narrative that he was unstable. Willow, though meant to be the one protected by Drew's interventions, often found herself sidelined as the battle between the two men escalated. Each time Drew spoke, his words were tinged with venom toward Michael, and though they cast Michael in a negative light, they also undermined the court's perception of Willow's case, as it became clear she was leaning on a man motivated by vengeance rather than justice. ADA Justine Turner worked tirelessly to maintain order and redirect the focus toward the children's well-being, but her efforts often seemed futile. The hostility between Michael and Drew overshadowed everything, pulling the proceedings off course time and again. Each objection, each raised voice, each confrontation widened the gulf between the original purpose of the hearing and the reality of what it had become. Justine, well aware of the court's intolerance for such chaos, warned that if the spectacle continued, neither parent would emerge with the outcome they desired. Yet her warnings went largely unheeded. The animosities had taken on lives of their own, impossible to contain within the structure of legal argument. By the midpoint of the trial, it was no longer simply about whether Willow's actions had endangered Daisy, or whether Michael's temper had disqualified him as a stable guardian. It was about power, pride, and the lengths each side was willing to go to destroy the other. Willow, desperate and fraying, tried to hold her composure, but every new piece of evidence gnawed at her defenses. Michael, fueled by indignation, tried to wield his proof against Willow with precision, but his own outbursts betrayed him. And through it all, Drew stood as both her defender and her undoing, a man whose personal crusade threatened to engulf the very case he had promised to help her win. As the custody battle wore on, Michael and Willow became so consumed with tearing each other apart that they failed to recognize the damage they were inflicting on themselves. Every angry outburst, every unveiled secret, every damning piece of evidence added weight to the growing perception that neither of them could provide the stability and emotional balance required to raise Wiley and Amelia. What was meant to be a stage for them to prove their love, responsibility, and commitment to the children instead became a window into the chaos and volatility of their personal lives. Each accusation, though sharp and biting against the other, only reinforced the judge's view that both parents were unfit, each undermining their own credibility with every move they made. Michael's determination to expose Willow's abduction of Daisy, though seemingly airtight, revealed a man too intent on revenge, too quick to weaponize his children's future in order to score a victory. His temper, already notorious, was on full display, making it impossible for the court to ignore his volatile nature. Willow, meanwhile, leaned too heavily on Drew's intervention, allowing his hostility toward Michael to shape her defense. Rather than presenting herself as a calm, nurturing mother, she appeared desperate, erratic, and dangerously entangled in alliances that had little to do with the welfare of her children. The trial, once expected to favor one side or the other, had devolved into a public exhibition of dysfunction, exposing two parents more focused on defeating each other than protecting the lives of the very children they claimed to love above all else. The judge's growing frustration was visible as the proceedings dragged on. He watched, stone-faced, as Michael and Willow exchanged blows in the form of testimony, evidence, and innuendo. Witness after witness painted pictures that highlighted the flaws of each parent, until the line between accuser and accused blurred into a haze of mutual destruction. By the time closing arguments were delivered, it was clear that neither Michael nor Willow had succeeded in convincing the court of their fitness. The children's best interests had been lost amid the shouting and scheming, and the trial had become a damning portrait of instability. And then came the turning point, swift, shocking, and irreversible. With the courtroom hushed in anticipation, the judge delivered a ruling that would send ripples through every corner of Port Charles. Neither Michael nor Willow would retain custody. Their relentless animosity, their failure to demonstrate stability, and their inability to prioritize Wiley and Amelia above personal vendettas had cost them everything. Instead, custody would be transferred to Carly, a figure whose history with both children and her long-standing presence in their lives positioned her as the most suitable guardian in the eyes of the court. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael, once so confident in his evidence, sat stunned, his pride shattered by the realization that his own fury had undone him. Willow, pale and trembling, felt the weight of every poor decision crash down upon her in a single instant, the image of her children slipping from her grasp searing itself into her mind. For both, the verdict was not just a loss, it was an annihilation of identity, a declaration that they were unfit to be the parents they had fought so hard to remain. Carly, though outwardly calm, was visibly taken aback by the magnitude of the court's decision. What was intended as a battle between two parents had ended with her unexpected elevation into the role of guardian. To some, it seemed the most logical outcome. Carly had a deep, established bond with both Wiley and Amelia, and she could provide the stability that Michael and Willow had failed to demonstrate. Yet to others, it felt too neat, too convenient, as if unseen forces had maneuvered the pieces into place for this very result. For Michael and Willow, the decision was unbearable. They had prepared for victory, braced for defeat, but neither had imagined losing everything to a third party. Their rivalry, their obsession with exposing each other's weaknesses, had blinded them to the possibility that they could both fall together. As they sat in stunned silence, the courtroom seemed to close in around them, the words of the ruling echoing like a final sentence not just on their parental rights, but on their very sense of self. In that moment, the custody battle was no longer about who loved Wiley and Amelia more. It had become a lesson in how pride, anger, and unchecked bitterness could strip two parents of the very thing they sought to protect. The judge's decision was a blow to both their egos and their hearts, but above all, it was a warning. Until they could learn to place their children above their personal wars, they would remain outsiders in their children's lives, watching from the shadows as someone else provided the home they had failed to create. The verdict that stripped both Michael and Willow of custody did not simply settle a legal dispute, it ignited a storm of suspicion that rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Almost instantly, the decision was seen not as a neutral judgment but as the product of unseen influence, a manipulation carefully orchestrated to ensure that neither parent emerged victorious. Michael, who had entered the trial confident that his evidence against Willow would guarantee his success, was blindsided. Willow, equally certain that Drew's backing and her own maternal bond would secure her rights, found herself devastated by the ruling. The abrupt reversal left both of them with the unshakable conviction that someone had pulled strings behind the scenes, reshaping the outcome to remove them from the equation entirely. The question that consumed everyone in the aftermath was simple but chilling: who stood to benefit most from this ruling? On the surface, the answer appeared straightforward: Carly. By granting her custody, the court placed Wiley and Amelia in the care of someone with long-standing ties to both children and a reputation for stability. Yet the very neatness of this outcome raised eyebrows. Was Carly truly the court's impartial choice, selected solely for her suitability, or was she positioned as the beneficiary of a hidden agenda? Her history of navigating the treacherous waters of Port Charles politics and her complicated relationship with Michael and Willow only made the situation more suspicious. To some, she looked less like a savior and more like a carefully chosen pawn. For Michael, the verdict was an unbearable humiliation. Not only had he lost his children, but the very evidence he believed would secure his case had been neutralized. He could not fathom how his carefully prepared attack on Willow had been dismissed with such ease, and his instincts told him the explanation lay in manipulation, not chance. Willow, meanwhile, was crushed by the knowledge that all her fears had materialized despite her desperate reliance on Drew. To her, the ruling felt like a calculated trap designed to expose her weaknesses and discard her, leaving her with nothing. Both parents, once enemies locked in bitter combat, now shared a new bond, the shared suspicion that forces beyond their control had deliberately engineered their downfall. This sense of conspiracy gave the case a darker dimension.